Hi, I'm Crompwell. Today we're going to take a look at the process that I went through to achieve this piece of concept work called Good Boy. And it is, of course, a canine-based piece of work or inspired piece of work. You can see here that I've started with a base mesh from my library of a canine skull, and we're in ZBrush. I've just added in a simple sphere with Dynamesh, and I'm starting to build out the forms of the canine neck and body. So the whole purpose of this was to challenge myself to learn a little bit more about animal anatomy because I don't do a whole lot of animal sculpts. So I figured I could use this as an opportunity to grab some reference, sit down, and do a sculpt and see what I could accomplish. So like I mentioned, I am working with reference. I always suggest working with reference when you try to learn something. You can't beat it, honestly. You might think you know what things look like, but reference is always there to save you when you don't know quite what's going on. So it's definitely a huge help to me. You can see here that I'm using a lot of really standard brushes, everything that's built into ZBrush. I really don't use that many custom brushes. I find that if I ever do, it's for really, really specific scenarios. So here I'm using the clay buildup brush, standard brush, Damien standard brush, the move brush, inflate brush, as well as the transform widget or transform gizmo, I think they call it. So just translating, rotating, and scaling. You can see that there. I mask off a lot of parts of my model there. So you can see I masked off the hip area and pulled those legs forward. And then Dynamesh, of course. And then I'm building out some of the form with the inflate brush as well as the clay buildup brush. When I'm not masking off things, I find that, sometimes it gets a little awkward when some of your forms are a little muddy or gummy. What I'll do is I'll use an insert mesh like I did at the very beginning and just insert in a sphere and then model off of that, which I think I'm about to do really shortly here. Right around here I think is where it looks a little awkward with those nubs, and I'm like, all right, so let's get the shape of the leg working there a little bit better. And I'm using the Damien standard brush to kind of carve in some of the musculature and landmarks to help myself as a reference, and I'll go back and forth and smooth those and build them and kind of push and pull them until I'm happy with them. And there you can see I added in that sphere. I actually scaled up the entire body of the canine because I realized that the skull obviously needs to be at least a little bit bigger to kind of match the rest of the body. And now I'm just kind of sculpting everything out and getting in those forms. Now, one of the things that I want to work on a little bit better is, of course, the model is a bit dense early on because I'm using Dynamesh. I'm getting a little carried away. And some of the problems that come with this are the move tool. If you try to use that with a really dense mesh, you can kind of create some gummy areas on your model that are not easy to control. Fortunately, as you saw earlier, I was still able to use the move tool to kind of move the arm musculature and get that shaped properly. So it's not too bad, but definitely for beginners, I would highly recommend working with as little dense of a model as possible and then gradually building your way up to more complex models, just to maintain as much control over it as possible. You'll see there that I decided to break symmetry and pose that leg because I knew that this wasn't going to be a production-based model, and I'm just going to be doing a procedural material setup later instead of doing UVs and manual textures. I'll just use procedural, and I'm going to keep the mesh dense. Now I can break symmetry and start to really pay attention to some of the poses and models that poses and the looks that I want to have for this model. So you'll see also that I split off the leg instead of just posing it, and that's because the first time I tried it, it actually, when I went to Dynamesh, it actually fused the knee with the elbow. And that, of course, is a problem if you want to move it later because you're going to have to figure out how to separate them and work around that. So that can be kind of problematic, so that's a good thing to concern yourself with. Another thing that I try to convince myself to do is hold off as long as possible before I try to refuse parts of the model back on. And you'll notice that with things like elbows and knees, for example, if you bend them too far into each other and fuse them back and Dynamesh them, you can create some webbing in between the joints, which can be really unruly and hard to manage. I think in this case it worked out fine. But, you got to be really careful about that, especially if you're not settled on the pose that you want your model to have in the end. Now here I'm trying to work out the anatomy of a canine paw, and I think those middle toes are a little bit long, and it ends up looking a little more like a hybrid between a deer and a dog and a human leg at certain parts, because of course I'm drawing on human anatomy. But I think it turns out well enough for somewhat of a surrealist type of thing. I don't aim for absolute realism. I try to get somewhat realistic, but here this is more of an exercise for me to just try to, get some sort of art done within a reasonable time frame. So I'm trying to challenge myself to move around the model and not get hung up on details too much, because I have a real habit of really lingering on details and then neglecting other parts of the model. So you'll see I jump around quite a bit, and then I'll come back and the model will kind of bother me a little bit. I guess I'm somewhat like mild OCD about certain things, I suppose. But yeah, I try to jump back and forth and give all sorts of attention to all the different parts of the model that deserve it. You notice here that I decided to save myself the trouble of having to remodel the foot and just mirrored it and brought it over to the other side. Now, in an ideal world where I'm learning the anatomy, I would actually go and do like a dozen or so sculpts of a dog's paw and really understand them. But in this instance, I was trying to focus more on getting the whole entire piece worked out well and give as much love to each individual part in order to address the entire piece as possible. And so that's what I was doing here. Now you'll notice that the leg there was looking a little awkward, so I posed it to kind of bring it in and angle it more so that we have those nice S-curves flowing throughout the model, the body. That nice contrapposto, as they call it in the fine art world. It's always good to pay attention to things like that. And here I am looking at the silhouette to try to make sure the whole thing reads properly. So you'll see me switch in and out of that every now and then. That's a really handy trick. Because again, I get hung up on those details, and getting hung up on those details is not something you want to do when you're trying to work out the form of your model. So again, I go back to the foot and try to figure things out with the knuckles on the top, because I hadn't done a whole lot with the top part. I had focused plenty on the bottom part. So now I'm trying to extrude things and push and pull, and eventually I get it to a part where I think it's looking good enough with a reasonable amount of detail. And then I move on to the hands here, and I put in another insert mesh and start to sculpt out the front paws. They're not really hands, they're paws. And I think the front paws turned out a little bit better than the hind legs did. And that's all right, it's a whole learning process. So again, if I were doing this for a production setting, I would probably go and sit down and do maybe a dozen of these and try to find the best one and really learn the ins and outs. And I'd probably try a bunch of different methods too. Instead of just modeling it out of a sphere, I would probably start with the sphere for the base of it and then use some other primitives to try to, get the individual toes and such. And here I am checking out the silhouette again and realizing that everything's kind of pointing in a downward direction, and I want to balance that out. So I've masked off the arm and put it in an upward facing direction to try to kind of counter that downward motion of everything else. And hopefully that adds a little intrigue, and you'll notice that I reposition the paws and kind of angle them inwards, maybe scale them into the right proportion. And there we go, angling them inwards. And I think there I've got the right scale for the paws, and now I'm going back and just paying attention to the back and adding in some additional landmarks, building up some of that musculature. And that'll be important because those will catch the highlights and the procedural material setup that I will be doing later inside of Octane Render. And here I'm kind of refining the shape of the arms, making sure that they look proper. I remember from when my dog was still around. He's since passed on. Miss him like hell, but I remember times when he'd be laying down on the ground and his paws would be out, remembering certain forms of the paw and the way it would deform with his fur and things like that, and just trying to match that up with a reference I have off to the side and thinking to myself, how does this actually work? Because it's quite a bit different than human anatomy, for example. And there are even some times where I would annoy him, and he always did this weird thing where he would have his back paws kind of like pushed out, like laying down on the floor. It was always kind of weird. Like most dogs will lay down with their paws underneath them. Well, he kind of laid out with his paws like to the back for some reason. And sometimes I would annoy him, and I would grab the bottom of his paw, like his back paw, and I would feel the tendon in the back there and think it was the weirdest thing. Now I wouldn't stress it or poke it too hard or anything like that, because he's my dog. I wouldn't want to hurt him. But I always remember that area there, the little tendon in the back of his hind paw. And so that was something that I had in my mind as I was going through this sculpt and trying to figure out how to do that. So as you pay attention to the bottom of these hind paws there was some of that I was trying to think of or pay attention to as I was forming those earlier on. So that's a bit of a little personal story there. Never discount your own personal experiences in how they relate to your artwork, for sure. They can definitely be very, very helpful. Yeah, so the rest of this is basically me just building up the forms, and I think we're getting pretty close to the point where I'll export this thing and bring it into the render engine and set up my look development and lighting setup and all that fun stuff. Like I said, this whole process took me a grand total of just a little over 2 hours, I believe. If anyone's interested in seeing the whole thing, please let me know. I've been considering doing like a Patreon sort of thing where I can actually share files and like the whole process. I know I've supported a couple of artists on Patreon as well as Gumroad, and I find that being able to see the whole thing is pretty useful, even if they're not talking. I can of course go back and record in more detailed commentary. In fact, I find that this is a little cramped here. So if people are interested in that, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm not able to do it because I would hate to do something that spend so much time on something that no one's really interested in. So let me know what you're interested in seeing, and make sure you connect with me on all the social media, like, follow, subscribe, notify button, all that fun stuff. I know it's kind of annoying when people ask for that, but the reason I do it is because I really do want to share all this information with everyone. Like, I have a passion for teaching this. I've taught at university, and honestly, I would gladly do it for free if I didn't have bills to pay, student loans and cost of living and all that other fun stuff. So, help me help you, really. I want to. It's a part of who I am. So, let me know. Anyhow, all of that necessary but annoying plugging away. Here I am in Octane Render setting up my lighting, and of course I have a very particular lighting setup. I have presets for my render setup and everything like that. Again, if people are interested, ask me, talk to me about it, and we'll see what I can do. Again, if I did the whole full-length tutorial, I could definitely talk about that as I go through it. But anyhow, I usually try to do like a very dramatic lighting setup. I try to think of some of the old masters paintings that I've seen. For example, one of my biggest inspirations is Caravaggio. I love the way he handles light and dark. The chiaroscuro, the fine art term there. The harsh contrast between a rim light, and you can see it there. What it essentially does is it allows the mind to kind of fill in the closure there of the mind to develop its own details. Now, even though I have all the sculpted detail there, it's not that I'm trying to hide it necessarily, but there's something mysterious about it and intriguing about it. And of course, I do go and try different lighting setups and see, less dramatic lighting, see if there's something there that could, bring audiences in and help them see. And then of course, as is usual, I hit a snag and a crash, which does happen from time to time, which is a very real reminder that you should always be saving your work. And then here I'm starting to get a little bit closer to the final result, where I'm dialing more of those cyberpunk, retro futuristic synth wave, what's the word I'm looking for? That futuristic pop colored lighting there, which is ever so popular on Instagram as of now. And then here I'm using a really cool plugin called TopoWire that creates dynamic splines, or splines that look dynamic. It can do both, but in this instance, they're not dynamic. They're just posed to look dynamic, and hanging them off and, getting an interesting lighting setup there. To add just a little bit more, because the scene was feeling a little empty, even though I had done all that sculpting. And there we go, we're dialing in the last settings there. So I hope this was useful to you. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. It means a great deal to me. And again, if you'd like to see more, make sure you like and subscribe. Follow me on social media. I'll make sure to leave that information in the description box below. And again, thank you so much. I am Crompwell, and I will be doing much more on this channel. Stay tuned. I will be releasing an announcement video that will have a little bit more information about what I'm thinking about. And then, of course, asking my audience to interact with me a bit to try to figure out what's valuable to all of you. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.